Good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar, sponsored by Hikvision USA. I'm Jacqueline Shawn, Marketing Manager for the Electronic Security Association. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. All callers will be muted for the duration of this webinar, so please be sure to use your question log to submit questions, and we'll be sure to address those questions at the end of the webinar. Additionally, a recording of the webinar will be available online in the members-only resource library at esaweb.org. Today's webinar on cybersecurity and video surveillance is presented by Coe and Djie of Hikvision USA. Coe has 20 years experience in providing network security support in both public and private sectors, from Fortune 500 companies to smaller enterprises and entrepreneurships. Starting in telecommunications, where he ensured network security for thousands of AT&T employees, Joe later developed software for the federal government, including the Mine Safety and Health Academy. As part of his work with Wyoming.com, Joe engineered a broad range of network facilities and provided networking solutions for the Supreme Court system. He managed and deployed WAN switches globally for IBM's secure network infrastructure. In 1998, he appeared as a keynote speaker on network security at NSA's annual conference in Baltimore, Maryland. He also worked as a network security manager for 3 Olympic Games: Atlanta, Salt Lake City, and Sydney. Today, Joe is a sales engineer for Hikvision USA. He has presented on cybersecurity and video surveillance at PSA Tech 2015, ASIS 2015, and TechSec 2016. Djie's career in the security industry began in the U.S. Marine Corps, where he installed and configured information systems and networks. As a civilian, he first made his foray into video surveillance as a sales engineer for American Dynamics Tyco. There, he designed IP video surveillance networks, optimized storage solutions, and developed transition strategies for customers migrating from analog to IP. He has loaned his network expertise to spearhead NVR system integration projects in major airports across the country and has provided IT services for the federal government. Now a sales engineer for Hikvision USA, Duane serves as a technical advisor and trainer to customers in the field, as well as specializing in network support. His skill as an educator was showcased at ISC East 2015, where he lectured on cybersecurity best practices. Also joining us later in the webinar will be Anna Boudinot, Content Manager for Hikvision USA. Anna will be moderating the Q&A session at the conclusion of today's webinar. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Joe and Duane.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Duane Djie, sales engineer out of Orlando. And I just want to go over some of the topics that we'll be covering today. 4 topics will include review of the best practices, examples of cyber attacks and responses to cyber attacks, and proactive promotion of cybersecurity, and the last topics of questions and answers. Now, as previously discussed, we've given presentations at PSA Tech, ASIS, ISC East, and most recently TechSec. We can also view our best practices by clicking on a cybersecurity webinar on the bottom of our webpage at www.hikvision.com. Before we get started, though, I want to make sure everyone had a brief overview of these cybersecurity best practices. So, Joe, can you give us some quick tips?
I'd be more than happy to. In fact, anytime we discuss cybersecurity, I like to go over best practices first. The first set of best practices that we're going to talk about today are part of a overlaying principle called AAA. And I don't mean the folks that help us schedule our summer vacations. It's authentication, authorization, and then accounting. And that starts actually by assigning each user who's going to use an appliance a specific account so that they can perform just the duties that are required by them. This is the first part of giving us accountability. If something were to occur and someone were to log in and do something mischievous or just inadvertently through programming cause a problem, gives us the ability first to see when and where and who did that so that we can work to resolve those issues. The next thing that I talked about is the use of strong passwords. Most appliances out there now, including network appliances, routers, switches, but camera gear and MBRs, there's a model to get away from using default passwords and to assign strong passwords. By definition, a strong password would be anything larger than 8 characters long, and most manufacturers offer the ability to go up to 16 characters, and it's a combination of upper and lowercase alpha characters, numeric characters, and using special characters as well. The stronger we make those passwords, the more difficult it is for somebody to try to breach or gain access to our electronic appliances. The last part of the AAA is the accounting, and any appliance that you use should be able to log every transaction that takes place on that device. Simply saying who, what, when, and where, and what took place, so that we can identify, not just with security breaches, but if something were to get broke, as an example, we can go in and do root cause analysis from that information. Another thing is implementing appliances that incorporate password lockout features. Now, we all know that the stronger those passwords are, the more frequently people are potentially going to mistype or forget those passwords. When we see those things occur, it's helpful if after the 5th incorrect login attempt, it actually locks that account out for a period of time. It's difficult to determine often whether it's somebody coming back from a vacation that forgot their password, or if it's somebody that's trying to illegitimately gain access to your appliances. So having the ability to lock that out is handy. In addition to that, a lot of appliances now have the ability to send email notifications in reference to those illegal or misdone login attempts. That can be helpful too, because it gives you the ability to proactively see what's taking place on your appliances. I mention this all the time. Keep the firmwares and softwares that you've got up to date. I mean, it's not something that's convenient and easy to do, but it is something that with due diligence does ensure a measure of security. Envision, if you will, going into a box store and buying a network appliance. One of the things that we run into periodically is we don't know how long that's been sitting in their inventory. We don't know that something hasn't been identified since that was manufactured that would be a problem for it. So when we identify that there may be a newer firmware out there, when we update those firmwares, first, we're resolving potential security issues that other people may have identified, or simply fixing bugs and problems with the firmwares or softwares. I mean, lots of companies write software code. Not everybody does that perfect every time, and when they identify there's an issue, keeping those things up to date is helpful. Use uncommon ports. IP traffic is designated over specific ports for the different types of traffic that's used. One of the things I like about the appliances that Hikvision sells is that we have the ability to select what ports we would like for those appliances to run on. Now, we do provide default ports, in fact, port 80, port 8000, and port 10554. But having the ability to select uncommon ports gives us a measure of security through obscurity. It makes it a little more difficult when somebody does a port scan and they find HTTP traffic on port 63,550. They wouldn't know what it was, so they wouldn't know what tools to use against that. I always tell people as well, if you want to make sure that your devices have at least a measure of security, don't directly connect them to the internet. I usually recommend having a firewall or at least a router in between where you can do some NATing, some number to address translations, so that people don't have the ability to get immediate access or vision onto those appliances. I know that it's a little more convenient when you put those directly on the internet and give them a public address, but when you do, you're actually raising the insecurity of that device exponentially. So I tell people use a firewall, or at least put a router that has the ability to run some firewall rules, and use NAT. Now, even if I'm using a firewall and I've got a router in the way of the internet, one of the biggest pet peeves I've got is people that refuse, for whatever reason, to put those security appliances behind locked doors. I go out and visit a lot of customers where, for convenience, they'll have the NVR, as an example, sitting above the manager's desk. And they wonder why periodically their video disappears. Well, if they continued to have their default username and password, or in a lot of cases they just wrote it on a sticky note and stuck it on their monitor, and they have access to that appliance because they never locked the door, that video or those appliances are no longer secure. So keeping them behind closed doors is imperative. The last part, I actually try to teach people to do up front, because you need to design a notification plan in the event that something does occur or you believe that something is occurring. You know, if you're out in the field and you see something that you believe is a vulnerability, or you've got an end user that believes they're having issues with their gear, having a plan in place where you can notify those folks that would be able to address that is imperative. In fact, with some organizations, it's not only imperative, it's required. If you do work in a HIPAA organization, as an example, somebody who maintains medical records, you may have to have that plan in place before you can even turn up live to ensure that if something were to occur, that there is a mechanism in place to get those things resolved as quickly as possible.
Well, that's great, Joe. I'm not sure if you can see on your next slides there. There we go. So let's go through some specific examples of cyber attacks that Hikvision has experienced, and let's discuss how these issues were addressed. So Hikvision's approach to cyber threats, no network appliance is invulnerable, but putting cybersecurity best practices in place can help guard against those types of attacks. Enacting strong cybersecurity measures may not be convenient, but they are well worth the time spent. And then if an issue occurs, Hikvision acts swiftly and efficiently to identify and resolve it. So let's approach these issues chronologically. In April 2014, the malware designed to mine Bitcoins infected Hikvision DVRs and NVRs where the user had not changed the default username and password. This caused the devices to cease functioning. Thousands of other manufacturers were affected by the same malware. So, Joe, what is Bitcoin?
Now, Bitcoin is actually a virtual currency that's used on the internet to pay for virtual or activities that take place on the internet. It's just a virtual currency that's collected for activities that take place on or in the cyber environment.
Okay, and so what is Bitcoin mining then?
Well, Bitcoin mining is actually a series of applications that are installed on computers that ordinarily just perform, non-cyber threatening activities. A Bitcoin miner is not unlike a gold mine where, you have people digging for gold. Well, in the Bitcoin mining world, that's an application that's performing, mathematical functions as an example. And when it completes those, that computer garners or gets X amount of coins for doing that. So the Bitcoin miner is not in and of itself a bad thing. However, we had the ability for it to be installed on our gear, and that's where it became a bad thing.
And what were the particulars of this incident?
Well, first, it impacted, at that time, actually just our DVRs. Our NVRs and cameras, we'd actually installed new firmwares that had made it not impossible, but more difficult to just install applications into our volatile memory. However, one of the biggest concerns was still using that default username and password. When people don't have or didn't need the ability to change that, anybody that could get on our gear could go out on the web and find out what our default usernames and passwords were at the time, and then they could log in directly to the box and they could install those virulent applications. The good news for us was with the Bitcoin miner, because it could only be installed or loaded into that volatile memory, it was something that we could quickly walk our customers, including end users, on how to expunge it from the appliance itself. All you had to do was unplug the power initially and let that drain, and when you would plug it back in and restart it, because it hadn't been installed into the CMOS firmware, it was gone. Then we would tell people, in addition to that, change your default password. And then people didn't have the ability to just get on that appliance and reinstall those applications.
So if the users had changed the default username and password, then the Bitcoin mining malware would still have affected their products?
Now, it's possible that it would have, but it certainly would have been mitigated up front a lot better. You know, I'm not going to sit here and say that just because you change a password on something and make it secure that it's going to be 100% secure. However, the likelihood of this happening would have been mitigated, you know, extensively just by doing those simple things.
So in August 2014, the malware targeting the Hikvision 7200 HWI and 7300 HWI series DVRs via the telnet port affected the appliances that were using the default password. The malware made it impossible to access the DVRs via the network connection. How many Hikvision products were impacted by this?
About 15% of our products in the United States. The models that are mentioned are actually DVRs and handle mostly analog cameras. Because of that, and the fact that within the United States, most of the products that Hikvision had sold up to that time were IP cameras and NVRs, it actually limited the amount of people that were affected by this considerably.
Excellent. So what was Hikvision's response to this issue?
Well, first of all, we went in and developed a new firmware so that we could mitigate the problems that existed with the IP stack. We also went in and started to turn off things that had been enabled by default, like telnet, so that we wouldn't run into problems with people having the ability to get on our appliances. And then once we had developed that new firmware, again, we sent emails to all of our distributions and all of our dealer partners, not just with, you know, notifications, but actually instructions on how to be able to take care of that. It required a firmware flush because we have our embedded firmware on our CMOS chips, and we had to come up with a process to do that. We did provide those folks with that, but we gave them a couple of other options as well. If they didn't feel comfortable doing that themselves, we were more than happy if it allowed the ability to have them send that to us, and we would exchange those devices. Or as an engineer with Hikvision, I went to several customer locations with integrators and assisted them in actually doing that. We volunteered to take care of the problem. So I thought it was actually pretty proactive after the fact in making sure that those people impacted were taken care of.
Excellent. So in November 2014, another incident happened. A buffer overflow vulnerability was found in Hikvision DVRs. causing them to lose the ability to record and play back video. Rapid7, an independent security data and analytics firm, identified the problem. Now let's talk about something called the buffer overflow. And I know we'll discuss a little bit about Rapid7, but Joe, can you tell us a little bit about that buffer overflow?
Certainly. First, we'll discuss what a buffer overflow is for folks that don't understand. And I use an example of an 8-ounce glass sitting on a counter and me preparing to fill that glass with a 1-gallon pitcher. Instead of filling it gently, I'm going to pour all of the water from the pitcher into the glass at one time. Now, it doesn't take very long for me to reach what the glass has the ability to take, so I overflow on the counter rapidly. Same principle with a buffer overflow in the electronic world. You have an application that is sending more data than the receiving application has the ability to handle. So it overflows, and not unlike with the counter example, has the ability to ruin anything that it should touch, like with corresponding memory. Does have the ability to create security vulnerabilities because of that. Gives you the ability to run malicious code.
Okay, and how did Hikvision approach this vulnerability?
Well, first of all, thank you, Rapid7, because they did notify us. In fact, they notified the whole world that we had the issue. When we identified that it was in fact a problem, we figured out where that issue existed within our software. It took 48 hours to rewrite the firmware to resolve the issue. And then, as I've said before, we worked by sending out emails, and in some cases I was calling distributions and our integration partners so that we could get these things taken care of rapidly. It wasn't a problem that we had that was evidencing itself greatly, but we wanted to make sure we mitigated it as much as we could.
Okay. And also, we stood up the Security Center page that was created on the Hikvision US website so people in the field could report any other concerns as well. Our next item, in March of 2015, use of the default username and password at the government facility in Jiangsu Province, China, created an insecure system that allowed unauthorized users to gain access to Hikvision recorders. Now, given all my experience in the security industry, I would not technically call this a hack. Would you agree, Joe?
I would agree. In fact, I would say that it was more like having your Ford truck stolen because you left the keys in it with it running and the door open, and you ran into the convenience store to get a soda and didn't pay attention to your vehicle. What brought this about actually was the integration. The default usernames and passwords were used, and the end user never changed those. And for that reason, it did allow for the unauthorized access and removal of video at those locations.
And what did Hikvision take in the aftermath of all this? What steps did they take?
Actually, we, in May of last year, as an organization, initiated a process where our appliances no longer use a default username and password. In fact, just to get the video streamed from a camera, the camera has to be activated first. Also, our MBRs, in order to be functional, have to be activated as well. And by activated, what I'm referring to is that they simply have to be given a strong password. That way we know that we're at least accomplishing that first step. In addition to that, we posted that information out on our websites, how to quickly change passwords, how to activate gear, because we had a period of time after May where cameras had to be activated and people had existing MVRs. So we had to walk people through how to do that.
Okay.
In addition to that, we did disable Telnet completely from our systems. If you wanted to be able to access that once you had activated that appliance, then you could go in and turn on Telnet for a given period of time.
Excellent. So the next one was took place just last year, in September 2015. The Xcode Ghost malware, designed to expose basic user information, was discovered in hundreds of apps available on Apple's App Store. Hikvision's IVMS-4500 app was also impacted. Over 400 apps from hundreds of different vendors were also affected by the Xcode Ghost. So how did Hikvision actually find out about this malware?
Actually, we were alerted to this by the folks at the iStore. They had some customers whose phones started behaving differently, and they reported that. And the iStore people went in and recertified a lot of software, and they were able to identify all of the applications that had been impacted with the use of that code. So they notified us, and everybody that had written code that was affected by this, their applications were removed from the iStore on that Saturday afternoon.
Okay, and what did Hikvision do in response?
Well, immediately upon having our software removed from the iStore, we turned that over to our folks in headquarters, and they started building the new application immediately. Now, the one advantage that we did have with this instance specifically is that when the iStore removes something, you get ratted out to the world. So a lot of end users, whether they saw it on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC or Facebook, were made aware that there was the issue almost immediately. We did, however, notify distributions and customers via email. We then built the new application. We had that completed by Sunday evening, so in less than 48 hours, and on Monday morning provided that to the iPhone folks for recertification, and it completed that process and was available to the consumer networks by noon on Tuesday. So from the time we found out about the issue, rewrote the software and had it certified, about 3 days.
Excellent, excellent. So the next, we're going to discuss some of the ways in which Hikvision is proactively promoting cybersecurity. If you go to www.hikvision.com and click on the Security Center at the bottom of the web page, you'll find a lot of resources that Hikvision has provided about cybersecurity. Joe, can you go through some of those resources?
Certainly. Some of the resources that we've got are like the best practices pages that we have, and webinars. This webinar, as an example, is being recorded so that we'll be able to have access and provide that to folks just as a continuing education tool. But we provide information to our customers on how to rapidly change your passwords or how to update your firmwares. In addition to that, we have links that give people the ability to let us know if they suspect that there's a problem, so that we can get the ball rolling to test, and if it is in fact an issue, we can then start to address those things and get them fixed.
Excellent, Joe. At the Hikvision's headquarters in China, there's a special task force designed to uphold the highest standards of the cybersecurity for the company. Can you tell us a little bit more about this group?
Yeah, we have a security framework group, and what they're tasked with doing is ensuring that any of the processes that we have, either in the hardware manufacturer or the software manufacturer, that those basic best practices and coding best practices for cybersecurity are always taken into account. You know, we try to mitigate as much stuff up front as we absolutely can, and we have a group that's tasked with coming up with the rules to do that. In addition to that, we've got the security component group that takes those rules and actually develops the security components to ensure that regardless of the product that we offer, whether it's a value series, the inexpensive appliances, or a professional series where they have more functions that they have to perform, that all of those follow those leads and that the practices and procedures that the framework group came up with. We then have a testing group. It's not good enough to come up with the processes. It's not good enough to say you've deployed those on all of your gear. We actually internally test those things as well. We do pen testing and quality assurance testing on a regular basis to ensure that our stuff is as secure as it can be at that time. In addition to that, we've got our resource center, and they're tasked with ensuring that we always have the latest lists and signatures of the vulnerabilities that are out there. So we're testing against what the real world expects us to.
Okay. The next thing is a very important element of making sure that our products are as cyber secure as they possibly can be is to work with third-party companies that routinely test our products and report back to us immediately if they notice any vulnerabilities. This is an ongoing endeavor. Can you tell us a little bit more about penetration testing?
Absolutely. I mentioned earlier that we test ourselves. We actually run tools that look for known vulnerabilities. It would be pretty disingenuous of us to say, well, we tested our stuff, you're secure. So in the past, we have contracted organizations to test our gear, one of them being Rapid7. I know last year they actually did penetration testing on our appliances. That was a part of an ongoing thing that we had done with them at the time because, as we mentioned earlier, they actually found one of the vulnerabilities for us, and we told them when you do our pen testing, provide us with the results, but if you find something significant, you can rat us out. So we do hire folks to test our gear to make sure that it's as secure at the time as it can be.
Okay. Now let's talk about CMMI, another way that Hikvision is being proactive about product safety.
Well, CMMI is a certification that's used for continuity and integration and the testing thereof, and it ensures that the testing tools have the most up-to-date and current libraries possible, so that when somebody says that they're compliant with something in a security realm, as an example, that the people that integrate with them know that the tools that were used were sufficient to say that it's not going to create a vulnerability within their environment as well.
Okay. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we are always working to educate our partners and customers on cyber security. So Joe, can you give us some more information about these upcoming events?
Absolutely. Anytime I can stand at a bully pulpit and talk about cybersecurity is one more opportunity that we get to raise awareness. And at ISC West, at the beginning of April, I will be leading a discussion there on cybersecurity, but why now and who is responsible? The why now is fairly self-evident with most of the folks that are going to be in attendance, or anybody, say as an example, that's on this call. If it wasn't prevalent and there wasn't a necessity for it, people wouldn't be joining in on the discussions now. The who is responsible part, I talk about, is it the manufacturer or the integrator or the end user? And in my opinion, it's all of the above. And we all have roles that we have to play to ensure, first of all, that we've mitigated those things up front as much as possible. And second, that if there are problems that occur, that we at least all know how to take care of them. The other one, we have a booth at ISC West, Hikvision does, and as part of that booth we have a thought theater, a stage, and continuously during that show, ISC West, I'll be standing and discussing things like best practices to anybody that'll listen, to be truthful with you. Again, the biggest part of what we do is try to raise awareness, and anytime I get an opportunity to do that, I take advantage of it. So.
Well, that's excellent, Joe, and thank you very much. So that leads us to our last topic, is the question and answers.
Hello, everyone. This is Anna Boudinot. I'm the content manager for Hikvision USA, and thank you so much, Duane and Joe, for all of this very valuable information. I encourage everyone who's going to be at ISC West to please visit the Hikvision booth, where you can meet these two gentlemen in person. In addition to the discussions that Joe will be leading, Duane will also be giving a presentation about video surveillance in the education vertical. So I'm looking forward to that as well. At this time, please be sure to use your question log to submit any questions you have. I do have a couple questions that have come in during the discussion, so I will address those now. This is a really good question. The first question I have for Joe and Duane is, I hear so much talk about cybersecurity these days, but why now? Why is it important now?
Joe, you want to take a lead? Oh, you go ahead. Okay.
I got it. The why now, specifically with our appliances. I'm going to use an example from just over a year and a half ago. Large box store chain who had 1.5 million plus credit cards snatched right out of their point of sale system. And the jump off point to actually get to that system was an access control system, a door system that was plugged in because it had Ethernet capabilities to the local area network where the servers where that credit card information was held. So the why now? Because if we don't do it now, we don't know what we're risking. In addition to that, one of the people that I use as a mentor out there in the cyber world is Secretary Djie Johnson. He's the Secretary for Homeland Security. And on numerous times this year, he's come out and said that although his job is ensuring that terrorism is not an issue for those folks in the United States, that his #1 priority is cybersecurity because of the number of attacks that occur on a regular basis and the numbers of people that are affected by them. So the why now is because it is getting to a point where we need to do it.
Great. I'm looking at a couple other questions coming in here. One is from someone who works with banks and credit unions, and their main concerns are the use of cloud service to access the DVR or NVR inside their local area network. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can. I put a lot of cameras and NVRs in banking institutions. It's a vertical I feel very strongly about. And they have unique circumstances more often than not because of the types of records that they hold. So there are things that need to be used when we design those networks to ensure that if they need to have remote access, as an example, that those are done securely. In those instances, I do use user accounts where people only have the ability to access the things they're supposed to, and then we ensure that every transaction gets noted in a log. We definitely want to make sure that those boxes are put in locked racks, usually in the same place that their telco equipment is at. So those verticals, because the video primarily is mission critical, requires that we take security and design it appropriately for everything they have, not just the cameras.
Thank you. The next question is, you mentioned that no networked appliance is invulnerable to cyber attack. Will there ever be a device that is rock solid and not vulnerable?
Do I envision an appliance that would be attached to the internet that would be 100% invulnerable? No. I realize that that's a short answer, but I can say from experience that anytime you attach something to the internet, that it is the just sheer luck in most cases that people don't have more identity theft issues, as an example. We've become a group of folks that use our smartphones for everything, yet most people don't even put virus or malware protection on their Android phones, thinking that it's invulnerable. One thing that we learned with the iPhone experience with our software, up till that point in time, the iPhone folks said that their gear was invulnerable because everything went through those certification processes. We found that's not necessarily the case, that anytime people are involved, there's going to be a potential for a vulnerability. Now, we can mitigate and make things, less likely to occur, but that's what we're doing, is just trying to proactively make ourselves less of a target.
I see. The next question is about Hikvision products. It is, what section can we go to on the NVR to check that the telnet is turned off and then turn it off without a firmware upgrade?
Without the firmware upgrade? You want to handle that one, Duane?
Well, I mean, now it's disabled automatically, but you can find it in the network settings, I believe. It's been a while since since it's always been disabled. Unless you want to add to that, Joe.
Actually, it's disabled and has been for about a year and a half by default, but for those folks that do have those older firmwares, it is in the networking section under the general tab, and you would go in and take the check out of the box where it was enabled and hit apply, and then it makes it disabled. I would, however, if you've got an NVR or DVR where it was still enabled by default, update the firmware on those, because that's not the only thing that may be an issue on those. Again, since we started initiating those processes where we were disabling that function, there have been a couple other vulnerabilities and some bugs that have existed that we've resolved with the newer firmwares.
I have another question about Hikvision products. You mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that one of the best practices was to make sure that each user had an individual login. How many users can be assigned on Hikvision gear?
Actually, it comes with one user, a super user account called admin, that we no longer have a default password for, coincidentally. But in addition to that, you can add up to 50 other operator users. So a total of 51 user accounts on the appliances. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. It gives you the ability to get the accountability that, say, in a banking environment that you would require.
Mm-hmm. The next question is, does ONVIF and RTSP streaming require the same password authentication and changing of default passwords?
Does ONVIF or RTSP require the same type of authentication? It does require authentication with our appliances. You have to be able to provide a known good username and password to be able to look at the streams of video. First, to connect to it, and second, to get the stream of video. But we actually will have the ability before this year is out to do that on different levels. We've identified that, basic security may be required for some folks, but depending on what kinds of applications you may be trying to seek, you may have to go to a higher level of security where several layers of encryption may be required, as an example. So we're working to address that currently.
Okay, the next question is much of the press lately regarding cybersecurity breaches points the finger toward Eastern European and Asian culprits. What can you say about Hikvision's relationship to its Chinese parent company, and what reassurances can we have about the cybersecurity of our products in that regard?
Well, again, I can tell you that, like I had mentioned earlier, it'd be disingenuous for me to sit in front of everybody and say that we test our own gear and that because of that we know we're secure. We do hire people to do penetration testing against our gear because it does give us the ability to say that someone other than us is looking at those appliances. But, you know, I've actually had the ability since I got my demo kit initially to go in and run common port scanning tools against our gear, even myself. You know, I talk about cybersecurity on a continuous basis, and if I didn't think I could do that with a clear conscience, I simply wouldn't do the job. Most of what we have to do is let people know that, you know, although we have a fear of folks in different parts of the world, just by sheer numbers, some of those attacks are going to originate from those locations. Let me give you an example. The United States has, what, 400 million citizens? China has more than 600 million netizens, people that get on the internet every week. Now, simply because of those numbers, they're going to have a greater proportion of folks that are going to potentially cause, you know, nastiness on the internet. However, I can tell you that a 14-year-old kid from Cheyenne, Wyoming, my hometown, was actually responsible for bringing down the Great Firewall of China a year and a half ago, completely by accident. And I'm sure those netizens weren't real excited about a kid in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, wreaking havoc on their internet. So I know that our president and the Department of Homeland Security have met with the leadership actually for China. And last year in October and November came up with an accord where they agreed that no state organizations would hack private enterprises. That was a first of its kind. Both countries recognize, both China and the United States, recognize that cybersecurity and cybercrime are huge issues, and they're working together to try to resolve those, which is kind of different.
Thank you. I've got a lot of questions coming in, so I apologize if we don't have a chance to get to all of them. The next question goes back to a minute ago when we were speaking about different user accounts. The question is, when should you use the operator versus user accounts, versus using the user accounts?
Well, we have actually 3 permissions with Hikvision gear. One account that's actually super user. We then have operator accounts and then guest accounts. As a rule, a guest account would be used just to view live video. You know, those are accounts that we can create rapidly, say for a daycare environment, so that parents can go in and watch what, you know, their children are doing during the course of the day. Operator accounts are used more for when you need someone to do programming on the appliances themselves. They need to be able to go in and set a schedule for when you want to do motion detection, as an example. So it's a higher level of authority that gives people the ability to perform those functions. Remote playback if they need to do forensics if an incident occurs, that a guest account wouldn't ever need to have the ability to do.
Thanks. The next question is, will the video stream actually be encrypted soon?
Will the video stream be encrypted soon? Yes. Now, the how soon is the question that I've got. We've actually put that on our roadmap currently at Hikvision because there are those environments that have mission-critical video where that additional layer of security will be required. It's not necessarily going to be the case for all businesses, but where it is going to be required, we're going to provide that functionality. We know we can do it. We don't know necessarily what the impacts are with some of the compression mechanisms like H.264, and we want to make sure that we do that as eloquently as possible when we do it.
Here is a simpler question. If a password is lost for a device, how do you regain access?
Hikvision actually has a couple of ways to do that. If you were to lose the password, say for an NVR, we have processes that you need to follow because it is a security appliance, and we actually advertise or talk about those out on our Security Center webpage. There's a technical bulletin that walks people through that. You actually download an XML file using our tools, you provide that to us, and then we generate, based on an algorithm that we can run, a code that will give you the ability to go in and reset and then deactivate those NVRs and cameras so that you can apply new passwords to them. We are looking at some additional mechanisms for doing that, but we'll be probably talking about some of those things at ISC West.
The next question is, what are your thoughts on sending video over an encrypted channel? Is this one we just discussed, or is this a separate question?
Well, it's kind of a separate question, and I actually have no problem with it, but understanding that if I'm looking at live video as an example, encrypting that will add a layer of overhead that will create a little bit of lag. That's the nature of Ethernet and IP traffic to begin with, is you get a little bit of lag, but as I'm encapsulating that in an encrypted format, I'm adding a little bit more lag as well. So if I'm looking at live video and I want to do something like initiate movement on a PTZ, I may not necessarily be happy with the performance that I get from that.
The next question is an interesting one. Do you foresee the federal government implementing any laws about cybersecurity?
Actually, this last year, at the end of the year, the House of Representatives and the Senate both passed legislation, first of all, just in reference to notification when somebody does get hacked. Now, there were just enough differences between them that the two bills are now in a committee to be combined, but from what I understand, as soon as that comes to concurrence and it passes the legislature, that our president's going to sign it. So it won't have punitive if you don't notify necessarily, but it will offer the guidelines in reference to that, so as those things occur, the federal government will be able to track because they do trending. Most of the large cyber attacks that occur, we actually knew. We had seen activities taking place, but because we weren't tied into a lot of those organizations in a timely fashion, we couldn't prevent those things from happening. So part of those notifications are trying to increase or lessen the response time to get things resolved, so that if somebody's being hacked, the Office of Personnel and Management with the federal government, that before 5 million records are disclosed, you know, they may be able to shut that down before you get to that kind of an impact. So yes, there are initiatives in reference to that. And there are things, when I started doing this, even if somebody hacked your computer in your home, most state jurisdictions didn't even consider that a breach of law until somebody would write to a hard drive. Somebody could go out and look at everything you had on your computer, and it never broke the law. So states and local municipalities are passing laws in reference to some of these things already.
In line with that last question, Joe, what do you think of the NIST cybersecurity framework as examples of cybersecurity best practices recommendations?
In fact, most of the things I talk about are in that framework in one point or another. There's the best practices that I talk about. And the one thing that was the last slide on the best practices where it says come up with a plan, that's actually in essence what that framework is a plan. You do an inventory, you figure out what your risks are, and then you determine if the risks warrant different levels of security or action that have to take place, then how to mitigate those things, and then it's a continuous process. So once you get through that, going back to the beginning and starting it all over again. For folks that don't know or have never had to work in that environment, it offers great instruction to help. It's not etched in stone because no two organizations are going to have the same requirements, just based on the inventories that you do yourselves. But it gives a very good platform start for people that want to use it.
Okay, and one question going back to the password reset information. Where did it go? I've got this whole list of questions I'm scrolling through on my chat screen. Okay, back to password reset. Doesn't the physical button resetting of the device reset the password too?
It does, and some of our cameras actually offer that, but we have several appliances that don't just have the little reset button. And part of the thinking behind that was because they're a security appliance, if someone were to go, say, into the office and steal that, and they didn't have the password, even if they were able to reset it back to the factory defaults, they now have an asset that they could sell. By having a process that's a little more difficult with some of those security appliances, if something should get stolen, as an example, it gives us the ability to track when they call in, even to do those resets. Because one of the things we ask for is a secure or a serial number. So it's just an additional layer of security for us. But with some appliances, cameras as an example, they have a little, reset button, and the old 30-30-30 rule still applies. Push the button, hold it for 30 seconds, discharge the power from it, keep on holding it on for 30 seconds, plug the power in, hold on for 30 more seconds, take your finger off the button, and it's back to factory default. It's just a lot of our appliances don't offer that anymore.
Okay, that is all the time we have for questions. Thank you, everyone who submitted a question, and I apologize for those of you whose questions we did not have time to answer. I want to remind everyone that they can get additional information about Hikvision's commitment to cybersecurity on our Security Center. Go to www.hikvision.com and click on Security Center at the bottom of the page. And now I will turn it back over to Jacqueline with ESA.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks also, Duane and Joe. Lots of informative content. We truly appreciate you shedding some light on this topic. I'd like to remind everyone, if you refer to your chat log, a recording of today's session will be available in the members-only resource library at esaweb.org. Once again, thank you for participating in today's webinar brought to you by Hikvision. We appreciate your time. We hope you found the content very useful, and we hope you enjoyed the rest of your day. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.